tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Very pleased to be sitting down right now with Ginny Roth, who is a partner at Crestview Strategy. She's also one of the preeminent conservative commentators of the era. You see her work all over, including in The Hub. You see her on TV panels, and we are pleased she is gracing us with her presence today. Ginny, good to talk to you. Thanks for sitting down.
Very nice to be here.
So I wanted to talk to you as someone who has written about some pretty complex and sometimes controversial issues, but someone who's also worked very much in mainstream politics about how we navigate what is often seen as a third rail, which is family policy, and there are a lot of places to go within that in the current political context. And I'll ask you first off, what a conservative policy on family would look like that you would champion that would also be viable within the political confines we have today?
Sure, yeah. Look, there's no question regular people get a little bit nervous when you start talking about family because it feels like something that's kind of private. It's people's own personal decision. And ultimately, if you, like me, believe that we should err in the direction of sort of freedom and letting people choose things for themselves and not imposing things from on high, then you have to be thoughtful about family policy. Look, I think there's cultural things conservatives can do, like make the argument for families, make the argument for a culture that supports families, but that's a little bit high-minded. There are also practical things we can do. So at the federal level, the Liberals are doing their own family policy, and I think it's bad. I think their child care, very, very one-size-fits-all. It has to be between 9 and 5. There's a massive shortage of supply, so there are all these subsidized spaces, not enough supply to actually give families spots in most neighborhoods. Is just not going to satisfy people in the long run. But, you know, the Harper era subsidizing people and giving them checks if they have kids, which, you know, to Trudeau's credit, he actually first he leaned into that policy, then he went with this one size fits all childcare. I think if we can go back to that, this idea that money follows the family, and that you're not certainly that you're not penalized for having kids. And there are some penalties that we should remove, but also that you're encouraged to, and you're going to be supported if you do, because it's hard, and especially in a cost of living crisis, it's especially hard. Then there are a couple of things I think we do at other levels as well.
So to go back to some of those Harper policies, I mean, the one that comes to mind immediately is the child fitness tax credit. That's a very family-oriented policy. It makes things easier for families. Income splitting, which was a bit more contentious in the Harper government, that's again an issue that makes things easy. But a lot of the problems with these issues is that they don't actually go to the core of building families. They certainly don't encourage people to have families. And, you know, on one hand, the idea of government centrally planning family just terrifies me as much as government centrally planning anything else. But on the other hand, we do have a problem. I mean, we do have a birth rate issue in Canada, and I don't think there's been a time that I can recall a Canadian politician talking about it, but it is a factor there. So what role should government have, if any, in correcting that? And if so, what's the mechanism you can get there that doesn't necessarily look like government trying to, you know, go around and manage people's family compositions?
Sure. Well, I actually think income splitting could make a huge difference. And the reason I think income splitting is powerful is because it tells families we're going to tax you as a family unit, not as individuals. And I don't know about other people. I find when I go to file my taxes, it's weird to file taxes as an individual. That's not how we run our household. We run our household as a family, and we should be kind of taxed that way. And if there's a way you can structure your family because one of you wants to stay home part-time or full-time, and that means someone has a disproportionately lower income, being able to not be penalized for that effectively, and making that choice just a little bit easier for people, I think could actually be pretty powerful, not just for the literal political outcome or policy outcome, but because of the cultural message it sends, which is, as a government, as a country, we value families. I think that, you know, you see Hungary experimenting with, I think it's like after a certain number of kids, it's either 4 or 5 or something, they just pay no income tax. That I think is meaningful, right? Like you may choose to have 4 kids just because it's like, if the government's going to make it that easy for me, maybe it's worth doing. And I wonder if you were to do things like that, it would have trickle-down cultural impacts so that you'd end up being in environments that are more kid-friendly. It wouldn't be so weird if your kid's crying on a plane. The idea you apologize if your kid's crying on, like, what kind of society is that? If you're, you know.
Yeah, and there's also, I don't want to put the blame squarely on government here, even predominantly on government, because there's a tremendous cultural and societal problem. I mean, you certainly don't have big role models and popular culture figures that are speaking up and bolstering the idea of family. If anything, it goes the other way. You get, Meghan Markle does an interview or something and talks about how, children are terrible for climate. So you do see these cultural forces that try to discourage and disincentivize. And that's, I guess, the big problem is that you don't have anyone that's really leading the charge and saying families are important. And historically, that's been the domain of, I'd say, a subset of the political class that's often not really all that mainstream.
That's right. And, when you think about the subtle influences that culture has, there is a role for public policy to play in that. I think about schools and curriculum. Our kids are spending hours and hours, the huge portion of their day in schools being taught curriculum by teachers. And today, I think they're being taught, climate change is threatening the planet. And if you have kids, you're contributing to that. And so just letting parents choose what schools their kids go to and therefore what curriculum they consume. I mean, I'm from Ontario. We don't have that option. In Alberta, at least, if you're a parent who wants your kids to be exposed to the kind of values that would support family formation, you can choose to do that. You can send them to a classical school. You can avail yourself of school choice. We don't have that option in Ontario and a number of other provinces across Canada, and I think that could make a big difference.
I don't want to do like the safe conservative leader thing of making everything about the economy, but I also do think that economic policy can be and often is family policy. Like if you're looking at inflation, cost of living, all of these things, that is a very real consideration. If you've got a family with 2 kids that's struggling to put food on the table as it is, the incentive to have a 3rd kid is just not there.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Look, the birth rates crowd would resist that argument a little bit because a lot of the research they do says that people fundamentally, it's not about economics, it's about culture. Having said that, I think economics impacts culture.
It does.
And so, Pierre Poilievre spoke earlier today, and he said, I can't remember what the percentage was, but there's a huge, terrifying percentage of young people who've just given up completely on being able to have a home, a house. A house and maybe therefore a home, right? And if you are psychologically accepting that you will never be able to afford a house, at what point do you say, well, I'm probably not going to be able to have time to have kids, which means, is there really a point in getting married? Is there really a point in dating and having serious relationships? I think that has a really corrosive impact on even the really early stage choices you make around potentially having a family. Yeah. And it concerns me that today we don't even know yet, I think, what Gen Z is going to do when it comes to childbearing.
Yeah.
And I think we could see birth rates plummet even more.
Well, and Poilievre has joked about it, but there's a serious point here. I mean, if you're 25 and living with your parents, your dating life is probably going to be a bit cramped.
Totally.
I mean, I would love to have been able to blame my dating issues on that when I was single, but I had myself to blame. But there is a real thing about if you're delaying your entry into adulthood.
Absolutely.
In a way, you're delaying everything else.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point when you might be married and have a house and have a career, you're 35. And sure, you can have kids at that age, but it's a much different calculation internally than if you're there 10 years earlier.
That's right. If you're a woman in her late 20s and you're trying to date and your dating pool, these men are living in their mom's basements, and who can blame them? They can't afford to live anywhere else. That's not conducive to the kind of becoming an adult, going through those life stages, dating successfully, getting married, that will then go on to, and to your point about this sort of fertility window question, it's awkward, I think, for people to talk about. Yeah. But I think culturally we cover that up a little bit too much. If you go to a doctor's office as a woman, they'll bend over backwards to tell you how to avoid getting pregnant, right? And that's fine for many women in many situations. I'm not saying that shouldn't be the case, but there's almost no education you get as a woman about how to get pregnant. God forbid, Yeah. And then a lot of women find themselves at 35, maybe grateful they're able to have one child, or in unfortunate situations, really wishing that they'd been able to start earlier.
So you worked with Pierre Poilievre in his leadership campaign as his director of communications. He's certainly been unafraid to tackle some bigger issues. I've not heard him go down the birth rate road, but I'm curious, do you think, to put on your pundit hat here for a moment, is he capable of having that conversation? And it's not even just a him question. Is Canada capable of having a politician talk about this?
So it was interesting. In his speech today, I think he's very careful to stick to the big, tough problems for which there are solutions, right? And for which he can, if he were to win and become prime minister, he can kind of work his way through solving some of the basic problems. Because I think he has some faith that take crime, right? We talked about housing, we talked about the economy.
Well, there's a family policy for you right there.
Imagine if you could, I live in a neighborhood with lots of families, and they're frankly up in arms because we have a so-called safe injection I don't think it should be called that, a consumption site in our neighborhood, and kids are picking up fentanyl patches in the playground. So I think his view is if we can get some of those basic things right, everything else will kind of work itself out. And I think he's careful to be consistent in being that kind of conservative. And I think he knows that if he gets sort of too prescriptive about, and that's because I want people to have more kids or because I want to have some sort of top-down solution that's going to drive family formation, that's going to narrow his appeal. And that's not what he wants. He wants to be able to win the kind of mandate where he can actually make a difference in people's lives. And I think that's wise, right? Honestly, it's why I'm glad that CSFN has this and why True North exists, right? Why we have all these players in the movement so that we can have some of the conversations that maybe are appeal to a narrower group of people and start to drive some public demand. Like what I would really love to see is if in a few years we can tell a story to the public where they go, yeah, actually, I'm concerned about birth rates, and there starts to be that demand, then politicians can respond and meet that demand with solutions.
Yeah, it's that whole downstream of culture attitude,
exactly.
right?
And so let's let, Polyev should let us impact culture. You and me, Andrew, will do it, just the two of us.
All right.
and then he should tackle politics.
All right, yeah, and that's the thing. A lot of people will look to politicians. I don't want to let politicians off the hook entirely, but a lot of people will look to them and say, why aren't you doing this? And, they can turn back and say, well, why aren't you doing it?
That's right.
Why don't you prove there's some support for this? And then I can go there. So, all right, well, glad you're not afraid to take this on. Ginny Roth, always good to talk to you.
You too, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.